ends at a town called Yaviza. Not slowly, not with a warning sign, not with anything that prepares you for it. The Pan American Highway, the longest road in the world, 19,000 miles of asphalt connecting Alaska to Argentina. A project that took most of the 20th century and the combined effort of 14 countries simply stops. The pavement ends at a barrier on the edge of a small Panamanian town, and beyond it there is nothing except 60 miles of jungle so dense and so hostile that in the 90 years since anyone first proposed the road, no sustained attempt at construction has ever been made. On the other side of those 60 miles, in Colombia, the highway begins again. Turbo, Colombia. The road resumes as if nothing happened, as if the gap were an oversight that someone fully intends to correct. Nobody intends to correct it. The gap has been studied, funded, surveyed, politically agreed upon, and then quietly abandoned more times than any other stretch of unbuilt road in the history of modern engineering. The reasons it hasn't been built have shifted with each decade: geography, then ecology, then disease, then politics, then something even harder to name. But the result has been the same every time. The road reaches Yaviza. The road resumes at Turbo. Between them, 60 miles that have defeated everyone who has tried. There is something specific about the Darien that no account quite captures. It is not that the terrain is impassable. Modern engineering has crossed worse. It is not that the project is too expensive. The money has been appropriated, the agreement signed, the surveys done. What the Darien has managed, across 3 centuries of attempts by 4 countries and 1 empire, is to find the exact weakness in each plan and use it against the plan's authors. Scotland tried in 1698 and lost a quarter of its national wealth. The United States tried in the 1970s and proposed detonating 294 nuclear bombs to solve the problem. Richard Nixon wanted the road finished in time to put his name on it, and resigned the presidency before either thing happened. A Chevrolet Corvair is still in the jungle somewhere, where a publicity stunt abandoned it in 1960. None of this is metaphor. This is the record. Start with what the Darien actually is, because most people who have heard of it have heard of it wrong. It is not a mountain range. It is not a single swamp. It is a 60-mile-wide collision of every possible obstacle to road construction, assembled by geology and climate into something that behaves less like terrain and more like a deliberate argument against the idea of a road. On the Colombian side, the Atrato River has spent millennia depositing sediment across a basin that is 100 kilometers wide and more than 250 kilometers long, building a swamp with no discernible bedrock. Engineers who came to survey in the 1960s probed the swamp floor and found nothing solid. Their official report described it as bottomless, not figuratively, in the sense that it was very deep, but literally in the sense that conventional probing equipment could not find the bottom. To cross it, the road would require what the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads estimated would be the longest bridge on Earth, built over material that offered no foundation on which to anchor it. On the Panamanian side, the terrain rises into steep mountains covered by primary rainforest that receives more than 3,000 millimeters of rain per year. In the rainy season, which lasts roughly half the year, rivers rise by meters in hours. The soil on the slopes becomes unstable. Roads cut into the hillside are not simply damaged by rainfall. They are actively unmade by it, the slope reforming around the cut as if the mountain is filling in behind the builders. Between the swamp and the mountains, there are rivers running in every direction, from the large and navigable to the small and sudden, flash-fluting creeks that can be knee-deep 1 hour and impassable the next. The forest above it all is one of the last intact primary forests in the Western Hemisphere, home to species that exist nowhere else, canopy so dense that the forest floor is its own climate, separate from the one above. Richard Nixon's engineer who surveyed the route in the 1970s put it plainly: steep mountains, incessant seasonal rain, inaccessibility, unstable soils, hundreds of rivers and streams, and a river basin with no discernible bedrock on which to build what would have to be the world's longest bridge. These, said the engineer, could probably have been surmounted, eventually. What defeated the project was not the engineering. Before anyone tried to build a road through the Darien, people tried simply to drive through it. The logic was straightforward. If you could prove the route was passable by vehicle, even without a road, you had demonstrated that a road was worth building. The Darien would be opened not by engineers but by adventurers, proving the concept so that governments would fund the reality. The first vehicular crossing of the Darién Gap was completed in 1960 by a team of 4 people: a Panamanian, his wife, a former British SS soldier, and an Australian engineer, traveling in a Land Rover they had named La Cucaracha Cariñosa, the affectionate cockroach, alongside a jeep. They left Chepo, Panama on February 2, 1960. They reached Quibdó, Colombia on June 17, 1960. The crossing took 136 days to cover roughly 125 miles. Their average speed, measured across the entire journey, was 201 meters per hour, about the pace of a slow walk, maintained continuously for 4.5 months. They built 125 log bridges. They crossed 180 rivers. The vehicle rolled over 3 times. 2 years later, General Motors decided this was a marketing opportunity. The company sent 3 promotional 1961 Corvairs, 2 Chevrolet Suburban carryalls, and a fuel truck into the Darien, with a team of 12 men and a film crew. The goal was 2 promotional films demonstrating the Corvair's durability. The implied message was that if a family sedan could cross the gap that had taken the Land Rover expedition 4.5 months, the highway practically built itself. 4.5 months later, the expedition reached Colombia. 2 of the 3 Corvairs made it. The third ran out of fuel and was abandoned in the jungle, where it remains today. The one Corvair that didn't survive the stunt that was meant to make Corvairs famous for surviving anything. The support vehicles fared worse. The fuel truck was lost. Both carryalls got stuck. The cars that completed the crossing were, in the words of everyone who saw the promotional film, comprehensively destroyed, bashed, scraped, and battered beyond what any Corvair advertisement would want to show a suburban family considering a purchase. The film was made. It was not widely distributed. What the Corvair expedition actually proved was something different from what GM had intended. It proved that crossing the Darien required 4.5 months of sustained effort by 12 men with machetes, rafts, and full logistical support, destroying most of the vehicles in the process, and that even that was considered a success. The first fully overland crossing by automobile, without using rivers for any part of the route, did not happen until 1985, when Lauren Upton and Patty Mercier crossed in a modified CJ5 Jeep. It took them 741 days to travel 125 miles. The 1992 Guinness Book of Records documented it as a feat of extraordinary human endurance. The Jeep and the Corvair are the 2 data points that tell you everything about the gap between what people imagine the Darien to be and what it is. Not impassable. The affectionate cockroach proved it wasn't in 1960, but passable only in the way that climbing Everest is passable. Survivable by determined people with the right equipment and sufficient time, which is a completely different thing from a road. To understand why the Darién Gap has stayed unfinished, you need to go back to 1698. Because the Darien has been defeating people for much longer than roads have existed. And the pattern established in 1698 has repeated itself with remarkable consistency ever since. In the late 17th century, Scotland was in a difficult economic position. English trade law effectively barred Scottish ships from the profitable routes of the empire. Scotland needed a colony of its own, a trading post that could connect the Atlantic and Pacific through the narrow isthmus of Central America, a shortcut that would make Scotland, not England, the commercial gateway between oceans. A Scottish financier named William Paterson, the same man who had co-founded the Bank of England, presented the plan to the Scottish Parliament. The colony would be established in the Darien, in what is now Panama. From there, goods could be carried the short distance overland between the two oceans, making Scotland's colony the pivot point of global trade. The Parliament was convinced, in what may be the single greatest act of collective financial optimism in Scottish history, the public subscribed an estimated £400,000, roughly a quarter of Scotland's entire liquid capital, drawn from investors at every level of society, from nobles to craftsmen, from people who could afford it to people who could not. 5 ships sailed from the port of Leith in July 1698, carrying 1,200 settlers. The whole city of Edinburgh came down to the harbor to watch them go, in what a contemporary described as a scene of tears and prayers and praises, the crowd sure they were watching the beginning of Scottish greatness. What they were watching was a funeral procession, though no one knew it yet. The Darien received the Scots the way it had received every other attempt to impose human intention on it, the climate they had not prepared for, the disease they had no immunity to. Malaria and yellow fever moved through the settlement with a speed that the colonists, arriving from northern Scotland, had no frame of reference to understand. Within 7 months of landing, a third of the original 200 were dead. The survivors, sick and starving, faced additional problems. The English colonies in the Caribbean had been ordered by King William III not to provide supplies or aid. Scotland and England were not yet united, and William was more interested in not antagonizing the Spanish than in rescuing his northern subjects. The Spanish, for their part, attacked. The first wave of settlers abandoned the colony and tried to sail home. Most did not make it. A second expedition had already sailed from Scotland, carrying more settlers who had not yet heard what happened to the first. They arrived to find Fort St. Andrew, the settlers had named the colony New Caledonia, abandoned and in ruins. Disease killed most of the second wave as well. The fort surrendered to Spain in March 1700. Of the 11 ships that sailed to the Darien, 1 made it back to Scotland. Of the 20,800 colonists who went, a few hundred survived, scattered across the Caribbean in English service or Spanish captivity. The ones who returned to Scotland were fewer still. Scotland had spent a quarter of its liquid wealth, much of it the savings of ordinary people who had invested everything and received in return several thousand dead and 1 ship. The financial catastrophe was so severe that Scotland's economy could not absorb it. 7 years later, facing insolvency, the Scottish Parliament accepted union with England. The Act of Union of 1707, which created Great Britain, was in some meaningful sense a consequence of the Darien. The colony that was supposed to make Scotland an independent power instead ended Scottish independence. The Darien did not just defeat the project. It ended the nation that sent it. 2 centuries passed. The Darien's reputation settled into something understood, if not precisely described. It was the place you did not go, the gap you did not try to cross. The native Embera, Guna, and Wunan peoples who had lived in the region for centuries continued to do so, which was itself a kind of proof. Not that the terrain was hospitable, but that the way to survive in the Darien was not to try to overcome it. You moved with it. You lived in the forest on the forest's terms. You did not attempt to lay 60 miles of pavement across a swamp with no bottom. Then came the Pan American Highway. The idea was first proposed in the 1920s. a road connecting all of the Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, as a symbol of hemispheric unity and a practical instrument of commerce and development. The formal agreement to build it was signed in 1937 by the nations of the Western Hemisphere. Over the following decades, section by section, the highway took shape. Panama finished its stretch to Yavisa. Colombia built northward to Turbo. The 60-mile gap between them was the last unfinished piece of a 19,000-mile project. By 1971, the United States had committed money and engineering resources to closing it. President Nixon, who wanted the road finished by 1976 for the country's bicentennial, announced agreements with Panama and Colombia to complete the final section. He did so with some enthusiasm. Privately, he had another ambition. The road was to be named the Nixon Highway. Engineers surveyed the route. They found the Atrato Swamp. They found the mountains. They found everything the Darien had always offered anyone who came to build. Their conclusion was that the project was feasible, expensive, and technically demanding, but within the reach of modern construction, which had, after all, put highways through the Andes and tunnels under the English Channel. Then, in 1975, the Sierra Club sued the U.S. Department of Transportation. The suit argued that the environmental impact assessment for the highway was inadequate, that the road through one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth had been approved without properly studying what it would do to the ecosystem. The suit succeeded. The environmental review process began again. While it was underway, Nixon resigned from the presidency over Watergate in August 1974, 2 years before the bicentennial deadline he had set for the highway's completion. The road that was to carry his name never progressed past the planning stage. The environmental challenge was legitimate. The Darien contains primary forest that exists nowhere else on Earth, species whose complete range lies within those 60 miles of jungle, ecological relationships that took thousands of years to develop, and that a road corridor would permanently fragment. The concerns raised in the 1975 lawsuit were not unfounded, and the reviews that followed confirmed them with increasing specificity. But the deepest obstacle, the one that has never been resolved, and the one that most people have never heard of, was not about trees. In 1954, foot-and-mouth disease was eradicated from the United States. It has not been recorded here since. The disease, a highly contagious virus that causes painful lesions in cattle, swine, and sheep, devastating herds and collapsing livestock economies, remains endemic in large parts of South America. North and Central America have stayed free of it for 70 years. The reason is the Darién Gap. The 60 miles of roadless jungle between Panama and Colombia is not just an obstacle to travel. It is a biological barrier. There are no cattle movements through it. There is no livestock trade across it. The animals on one side cannot reach the animals on the other, and so the disease cannot spread northward. The gap functions, entirely by accident, as the most effective veterinary quarantine measure in the Americas. The U.S. Department of Agriculture understood this by the early 1970s. A GAO report from 1977, written during the active construction planning phase, stated the conclusion plainly. Completion of the Darién Gap Highway was dependent upon establishing successful control of foot-and-mouth disease in Colombia. 3 years of cooperation between the United States and Colombia, mostly at U.S. expense, had achieved little. There was no assurance, the report noted, that Colombia was fully committed to the eradication program. The implications were not subtle. If a road opened, the Darien and cattle movements followed, and cattle movements always follow roads. Foot-and-mouth disease would reach Central America within years. From there, it would move north. The U.S. cattle industry, which had not dealt with the disease in living memory, and had no serious capacity to contain an outbreak, would face a catastrophe that economists estimated at billions of dollars. The road would not just cross the Darien, it would end the biological barrier that had protected North American livestock for decades. The USTA's opposition hardened into something that no amount of engineering ambition could overcome. Environmental organizations opposed the road from one direction, the U.S. Department of Agriculture opposed it from another. Indigenous peoples opposed it from a third. The coalition had almost nothing else in common. They agreed on nothing except this: the road should not be built. Construction planning stopped. It has not seriously resumed since. Which brings us to the nuclear option, which deserves its own moment because it is exactly as strange as it sounds. Before the Pan American Highway became the primary framework for thinking about the Darien, there was a different project: a canal. Not a road across the isthmus, but a waterway through it. A sea-level canal connecting the Pacific and Atlantic through Panamanian or Colombian territory, a supplement or alternative to the Panama Canal. The engineering challenge of building such a canal through the Darien was obvious. The terrain was impassable by conventional means, but in the early 1960s, conventional means was not the only option under consideration by the United States government. Under Project Plowshare, a research program dedicated to finding peaceful uses for nuclear explosives, American engineers had been studying whether nuclear detonations could substitute for conventional excavation at large scales. In 1964, following anti-American riots in Panama that put the future of the canal zone in question, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed the Atlantic-Pacific Interoceanic Canal Study Commission to investigate alternative routes for a sea-level canal. Congress appropriated $17.5 million, roughly $185 million in current terms, to fund the study. The commission looked at two routes: one through the Darien region of Panama, one through northwestern Colombia. For the Panamanian route, engineers proposed detonating 294 nuclear explosives along the route in 14 separate blasts, each detonation using the explosive equivalent of millions of tons of conventional explosive to excavate the terrain down to sea level. The New York Times, reporting on the proposal, noted that the nuclear fallout from the blasts would be safe, given that the jungle was only sparsely populated. The sparsely populated jungle included several indigenous communities that had lived in the Darien for centuries. The commission studied the proposal for 6 years. In 1970, it reported that the technical feasibility of nuclear excavation remained unproven. The issue was not principally the radiation, or the indigenous people, or even the ecology. The problem was slope stability. The mathematics of using nuclear explosions to blast a stable canal trench through the Darien geology did not reliably work. The proposal was abandoned. The nuclear canal was never built. The Darien received the proposal the way it had received the Scots in 1698 and the Pan American Highway planners in the 1970s. It waited for the specific technical flaw that would end the attempt, and it found one. Which brings us to the nuclear option, which deserves its own moment because it is exactly as strange as it sounds. Before the Pan American Highway became the primary framework for thinking about the Darien, there was a different project: a canal, not a road across the isthmus, but a waterway through it. A sea-level canal connecting the Pacific and Atlantic through Panamanian or Colombian territory, a supplement or alternative to the Panama Canal. The engineering challenge of building such a canal through the Darien was obvious. The terrain was impassable by conventional means. But in the early 1960s, conventional means was not the only option under consideration by the United States government. Under Project Plowshare, a research program dedicated to finding peaceful uses for nuclear explosives, American engineers had been studying whether nuclear detonations could substitute for conventional excavation at large scales. In 1964, following anti-American riots in Panama that put the future of the Canal Zone in question, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed the Atlantic-Pacific Interoceanic Canal Study Commission to investigate alternative routes for a sea-level canal. Congress appropriated $17.5 million, roughly $185 million in current terms, to fund the study. The commission looked at two routes, one through the Darien region of Panama, one through northwestern Colombia. For the Panamanian route, engineers proposed detonating 294 nuclear explosives along the route in 14 separate blasts, each detonation using the explosive equivalent of millions of tons of conventional explosive to excavate the terrain down to sea level. The New York Times, reporting on the proposal, noted that the nuclear fallout from the blasts would be safe, given that the jungle was only sparsely populated. The sparsely populated jungle included several indigenous communities that had lived in the Darien for centuries. The commission studied the proposal for 6 years. In 1970, it reported that the technical feasibility of nuclear excavation remained unproven. The issue was not principally the radiation, or the indigenous people, or even the ecology. The problem was slope stability. The mathematics of using nuclear explosions to blast a stable canal trench through the Darien geology did not reliably work. The proposal was abandoned. The nuclear canal was never built. The Darien received the proposal the way it had received the Scots in 1698 and the Pan-American highway planners in the 1970s. It waited for the specific technical flaw that would end the attempt, and it found one. The gap endured. But in the last decade, something changed that no one who opposed the road had anticipated. In 2015, roughly 10,000 people crossed the Darién Gap on foot. This was already considered a crisis. 10,000 people walking through 60 miles of primary jungle, one of the most dangerous tracts of terrain in the Western Hemisphere, with no infrastructure, no medical support, no rescue services, and a well-documented presence of armed groups who robbed, assaulted, and killed migrants in the forest. By 2022, the number was 248,000. By 2023, it was 520,000, more than double the previous year. A record that was described as a humanitarian catastrophe the moment it was announced. Think about that number for a moment. 500,000 people in a single year. The route that had taken a dedicated team 2 years to cross with a specially equipped jeep and full logistical support. The route that had defeated a Chevrolet Corvair publicity stunt, a Scottish colonial empire, a U.S. infrastructure project, a nuclear excavation proposal, and the most powerful road-building administration in American history, was being crossed on foot by an average of more than 1,400 people every day. They were Venezuelan families carrying children on their backs, Ecuadorians with 2 weeks of food in a pack, Haitians who had already crossed one continent before they reached the gap, people from sub-Saharan Africa, from China, from Afghanistan, 97 nationalities in the first 7 months of 2023 alone. Almost all of them were going to the same place, the United States. And the Darien was the only route that wasn't cut off by sea, visa requirement, or border wall. Médecins Sans Frontières treated 676 victims of sexual assault in 2023. At least 312 migrants had been reported missing or dead on the route between 2015 and 2022. A number the organizations working there consistently described as a fraction of the actual total, because bodies in the Darien are rarely found. The forest absorbs them. The rivers take them. The exact numbers are unknown, because no government has any systematic way of counting the dead in 60 miles of primary jungle, with no road access and no emergency services. Nearly 1 in 4 people who crossed in 2023 was a child. Some were infants. Some parents carried them the entire way. The gap that engineers and governments had found too complex to bridge with asphalt was being crossed daily by people with backpacks and sandals and nothing else, because the alternative was worse. There is a particular irony in this that no one has fully resolved. The gap exists in part because building a road through it would make migration easier, a concern that Panamanian and American officials have never stated publicly, but that researchers studying the region have documented as an unstated factor in the persistent failure to build. The gap functions as a natural deterrent. Cross it on foot, and some percentage of migrants will turn back, will get sick, will be robbed, will not survive. The difficulty of the crossing is not incidental to the policy. The difficulty is the policy. What no government calculated, because no government was doing serious calculation about this possibility in the 1970s, when the road was last seriously planned, was what would happen when the desperation on one side of the equation became larger than the danger on the other. When the situation in Venezuela, in Haiti, in Ecuador became sufficiently catastrophic, the Darien stopped being a deterrent. It became a route. The most dangerous route in the Western Hemisphere became a traffic jam. The governments on both sides of the gap are now spending money on barbed wire fencing, deportation flights, and militarized patrols to manage the flow that the absence of a road was supposed to prevent. The gap has been roadless for 90 years and is less of a barrier than it has ever been. The road still ends at Yaviza. Drive to the end of the pavement on a clear morning, and the jungle begins at the barrier with a completeness that is difficult to describe. Not the edge of a park or the start of a hiking trail. A wall, the sound changes, the air changes. 30 meters into the tree line, the road is a memory and the forest is everything. And the 60 miles between here and Turbo are a passage that has claimed thousands of lives and defeated every formal attempt to cross it with anything more permanent than feet. On the Colombian side, the highway resumes at Turbo. Same name, same numbering, as if the gap were temporary, an administrative oversight, a construction delay that has now lasted 90 years. The Darien does not need anyone to win. It only needs to find the specific reason each attempt fails. Scotland ran out of settlers. Nixon ran out of time. The nuclear engineers ran out of slope stability. The environmentalists found a lawsuit. The USTA found the cattle. Each coalition, each attempt, each plan had something in it that the Darien could use. The migrants who crossed on foot in 2023, 500,000 of them, carrying children, carrying almost nothing else, could not be stopped by any of it. Not by the swamp, not by the mountains, not by the armed groups in the trees, not by the absence of medical care or rescue or any infrastructure of any kind. They walked through the gap that has defeated every engineer, every empire, every government that tried to formalize a crossing, and they came out the other side. They brought no machines. They had no plan. They just walked. The Darien has never found a way to stop that.